Out of all the different types of law enforcement, FBI agents definitely see some of the craziest and traumatic stuff imaginable. But what are some of the most bone-chilling stories ever revealed? We're about to find out. Welcome back, everyone. My name is Kennedy, and today we are counting down some of the most disturbing stories, cases, and mysteries involving the FBI. So with that being said, let's dive right in. Starting us off at number 10 is Dan Cooper. Back in 1971, a man who went by the alias Dan Cooper hijacked a commercial plane, and no one has ever been able to find him since. According to those involved, shortly after takeoff, he handed a note to a flight attendant claiming to have a bomb in his briefcase. He demanded 4 parachutes and $200,000 in $20 bills, which is the equivalent of like $1.2 million nowadays. Otherwise, he was going to kill everyone on the plane. After the flight landed in Seattle, Cooper released the 36 passengers once authorities had provided him with the money and parachutes, but kept both pilots, one flight engineer, and flight attendants as hostages on the plane. From there, he forced them to fly to Mexico City, but somewhere over Nevada, Cooper jumped off the plane with the stolen cash. The FBI launched a massive search that is still considered one of the longest and most exhaustive investigations in FBI history. But Dan Cooper has yet to be found, and I'm sure many agents lost sleep over trying to figure out this case. Moving on to number 9, the West Mesa bone collector. Back in 2009, a woman on a leisurely walk with her dog came across something peculiar. A human bone. Little did she know, she'd stumbled upon a major crime scene. Upon her discovery, authorities became immediately involved and discovered that it was a mass grave filled with human remains. But how did they get there? A killer dubbed the West Mesa bone collector. Active between 2001 to 2005, the killer was known to target young women, usually Hispanic, and almost always involved in late night services or the trade, but not exclusively, which made it hard to identify why he chose his victims. While we know practically nothing about the killer, we do know that he would take the bodies to the desert to dispose of them. After years of police investigation, the remains of 11 women were found scattered in the deserts of Albuquerque, but the exact way they died is yet to be discovered, as medical examiners and forensic experts have not been able to identify his methods, which is very unusual. Sadly, neither police or FBI have ever been able to track down who was responsible for ending these young women's lives, and I am sure the agents on the case are continually disturbed by the fact that he remains on the loose. Moving on to number 8. Glendon Scott Crawford. In 2012, Glendon Scott Crawford, who was a part of the Pointy Hat white supremacist group, conspired with a guy named Eric Fate to turn an industrial-grade X-ray radiation device into a weapon of mass destruction. The plan was to have a remote-controlled death ray he could use on Muslims in the United States, targeting mosques, community centers, and so on. So Crawford sought assistance from Chris Barker, one of the Imperial Wizards in his hate group. However, what Crawford did not know was that Barker, in an effort to handle his own felony charges, had become an informant for the FBI. This led to another FBI agent coming on the case undercover, and eventually, once there was enough evidence stacked against Crawford's plan to commit acts of he was sentenced to 30 years behind bars. Still, I can only imagine how disturbing it must have been for those undercover agents to be in the same room with such a disgusting man. Moving on to number 7, Richard Trenton Chase. Often referred to as the Vampire of Sacramento, Chase was a truly terrifying killer who took the life of 6 people in just 1 month back in 1977. Before he turned to human victims, Chase would capture animals and bring them back to his apartment to kill and disembowel. From there, he would eat them raw, sometimes mixing them with Coca-Cola in his blender. Then in 1973, Chase was forcibly admitted to an institution after being taken to emergency for trying to inject rabbit's blood into his veins. While in the facility, he was diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia and became known as the Vampire, as he all too often killed animals and drank their blood. But by 1976, he was deemed no longer a threat to society and released back into his mother's custody. curiosity. Tragically, she began weaning him off his medication, believing he didn't really need it, and once again he slipped into old habits. But this time it wasn't birds and rabbits Chase was harming, he was breaking into homes and killing people before treating them just as he did his animals. Eventually he was put on trial for his 6 victims and a jury ruled him guilty, rejecting the defense's attempt that he could not be tried due to insanity. Chase was sentenced to death, but ended up taking his own life while behind bars before his execution. Coming in at number 6, Daniela Green. Born in Germany, Daniela moved to the US with her family before she was hired as a contract linguist for the FBI in 2011. While working at the FBI, they made use of her bilingual skills and ended up assigning her to a German terror criminal known as Individual A at the time. Through research, Green discovered her subject was a former rap artist named Dennis Kuisbert who had joined, that group, and over time, Green found ways to correspond with Kuisbert. However, in a shocking turn of events, their relationship turned romantic. Soon Green made secretive plans to fly out to Syria and meet him, and within hours of her arrival, the two got married. But it didn't take long before she realized what a mess she found herself in and ended up emailing an acquaintance for help. Within 5 weeks, American authorities caught up to her. Green was arrested and returned to the US, but was released after only 9 months in jail, and the FBI spun her involvement with Kuisbert as that of an unsuspecting linguist duped by a conniving criminal. Still, I can only imagine how disturbing it must have been for everyone involved, knowing that one of their own had double-crossed them and married the literal enemy they were trying to take down.
Were former members and even high-ranking members of the Third Reich ever involved in scientific research in the United States after the Second World War? Well, surprisingly, yes. It was all part of Operation Paperclip. This was a covert program conducted by the United States after the Second World War to recruit German scientists, engineers, and technicians, particularly those involved in rocketry, aerospace, and intelligence work. They wanted to bring these experts to America and then use them for their knowledge and expertise, while also preventing them from falling into the hands of the Soviet Union during the emerging Cold War. These scientists were offered immunity and security clearances in exchange for their cooperation and relocation to the US, but some stuff ended up getting swept under the rug. You see, President Truman agreed to the program, but only under specific conditions. The scientists couldn't have been members of that party. But some scientists were just too smart to pass up, even with their involvement in the Third Reich, so the Joint Intelligence Objectives Agency destroyed evidence that linked certain scientists to the Third Reich while creating false political biographies for them.
Next up, we have a pretty dark conspiracy theory that no one actually wanted to be true, but ended up being true anyways. The theory that the government was using the deceased bodies of young men and women to test the effects of nuclear radiation, aka Project Sunshine. After the United States dropped nuclear explosives Little Boy and Fat Man over Hiroshima and Nagasaki, nuclear war went from being some kind of far-off fantasy to a very scary reality. The problem with this was the government had very little knowledge of the effects of nuclear radiation on the human body, and so in true corrupted official fashion, they began testing those effects on the deceased bodies of US citizens. At the time, this was kept secret from the public, but because they did put out a statement saying that they were testing the effects of radiation on human tissue, the public began speculating that they were doing, well, exactly what they were doing. All in all, they took body parts from deceased individuals belonging to somewhere around 1,500 families. The project started in 1953, but it wasn't revealed until 3 years later in 1956, after growing public concern and internal pressure forced the government to disclose.
Have any musicians ever been under government surveillance because of their politically charged music? 100%, including John Lennon, who was known for his activism and outspoken views against the Vietnam War and other political issues. The FBI was particularly concerned about Lennon's influence. He was, and still is, one of the most famous musicians of all time, and there was a real concern that his anti-war activism could rally enough opposition to the government to cause some real problems. So the FBI started spying on Lennon, collecting information on his activities, speeches, and connections to various activist groups. There was wiretapping, his mail was monitored, agents were even sent to snoop in on his friends and groups he was involved with. The FBI also compiled extensive files on Lennon and Yoko Ono. He may have been the most famous surveyed person at the time, but Lennon was far from the only person the FBI was watching.
Next up, we have the gaydar conspiracy theory, which unfortunately in the 1980s was proven to be much more than just a theory. In the 20th century, both public and political opinions of homosexuality were quite well known, and they weren't good. It was around this time that Canadians came up with the theory that their government had developed some kind of gaydar to locate and terminate the employment of homosexuals working as civil servants, as Mounties, or in the military. The thing is, Canada actually did that. Believe it or not, in the 1960s they hired a university professor to create a machine that would determine sexual preference, which at the time it was believed he did successfully. The machine worked by measuring pupil dilation in relation to homosexual imagery, and it was used to terminate or exclude over 400 men from working in, for, or adjacent to the Canadian government. The existence of the machine was revealed in 1980, and in 1981 a documentary entitled The Valor and the Horror was created to showcase the gross mistreatment of the homosexual community in Canadian workforces at the time.
If I were to tell you that the Church of Scientology infiltrated 136 government organizations in the 70s, would you believe me? Because it really did happen. Operation Snow White was one of the largest infiltrations of the US government in history. It was a huge scheme cooked up by the Church of Scientology. Around 5,000 agents were sent to get into all sorts of government agencies like the IRS, the DEA, foreign embassies, even private agencies that were critical of L. Ron Hubbard and Scientology. Their main target was the United States, but other countries were involved too. Their goal was to listen in on conversations using wiretaps and snatch up all these documents on the church, but the government wasn't having it, and in 1977 the FBI raided several Scientology spots with 156 agents. In 1979, Mary Sue Hubbard, L. Ron Hubbard's wife, and some other high-ranking Scientologists ended up receiving jail time. Can't do a haunted fast food list without McDonald's, right? Well, this particular McHaunt is in Cuero, Texas. Now, before it became the Golden Arches, it was a gas station where a number of pretty dark accidents took place. A mother accidentally ran over her own son, killing him. A mechanic was crushed under a car lift. I'm sure there's more, gonna guess a deadly robbery or two. Point is, ever since the place got turned into a McDonald's, staff have been pretty spooked. People will hear eerie sounds late at night, other than the typical types of sounds you hear coming out of people at McDonald's late at night. Toilets will flush by themselves, and a strange shadowy figure is sometimes seen in the walk-in fridge. So is this McDonald's haunted by the spirits of the people who are crushed by cars at the former gas station? Certainly seems like a possibility.
Next up, we have a Taco Bell located in Twinsburg, Ohio, that is haunted by not one, not two, not three, but 4 separate ghosts. The first of which is a large burly woodsman. There's also a military man and a young woman in a white dress. The woodsman and the military man have often been seen appearing in back hallways of the restaurant, while the young woman has been seen walking around the kitchen area. In one instance, an employee reported having seen a young woman wearing a white gown walk into the walk-in freezer, and she closed the door behind her. When the employee went to check it out, he opened the freezer door to find no woman, but instead food items strewn all across the freezer floor. The fourth ghost who haunts the establishment is a young man dressed in an outdated Taco Bell uniform. Legend has it he died while working at the restaurant and now spends his days helping out the other employees with their daily tasks. So he's not such a bad guy. He's been seen mopping up the floors, washing dishes, and handing out unsolicited advice about how he believes the restaurant should be run. One customer of the Twinsburg Taco Bell even shared a story about how one night they placed an order with an employee, but they forgot to order hot sauce. When they went back up to the counter, another employee asked if he could take their order. They said that their order had already been placed, to which the man behind the counter replied, "With who? I'm the only one here."
Next up, we have the McBarge in Vancouver, Canada. Yes, just like the floating Krusty Burger in The Simpsons, there really is a floating McDonald's out in the middle of False Creek, Vancouver, or at least there used to be. It now sits completely derelict in Maple Ridge, British Columbia. It opened in 1986 as part of Expo 86, a World's Fair that was being held in Vancouver that year. It was a nautical-themed McDonald's, which is fun, but on top of that, the place was pretty cutting edge and high-end for a McDonald's at the time. Food was delivered via a conveyor belt, there were real houseplants for decoration, the staff were dressed as sailors, and customers seemed to really like it. But it wasn't around for long. After Expo 86, the place was closed, and the barge has passed from owner to owner in the years since, falling further and further into disrepair. And over the years, people have broken into the place to explore and have told some pretty eerie stories about the place. Supposedly, it's haunted, and looking at images of the inside online, you can certainly see why.
Next on our list today, we have a Burger King located in West Palm Beach in Florida. From the outside, it looks pretty normal, but legend has it that a young man died somewhere in or around the restaurant and now roams around the building causing chaos and scaring staff members. The ghost has been affectionately named the Burger Prince and has often been seen by the night janitors and closing staff of the establishment. Once the restaurant closes and all the doors are locked, the young man appears. One janitor who saw the man tried to chase him out of the establishment on 2 separate occasions, but both times this Burger Prince simply vanished into thin air right in front of the workers' eyes. Eventually, the janitor had enough, and he ended up quitting his job at the restaurant, claiming that he was unsettled by the sightings and the haunting energy he felt whenever he entered the establishment. Many other members of the staff have reported seeing the man as well, but it appears as though they are less bothered, probably because most of them aren't stuck with the ghost when they're all alone after dark.
The Subway sandwiches in Dodgeville, Wisconsin is said to be haunted. Now, pretty much every Subway is haunted, in a way, by the lingering presence that is Jared Fogle. That's stained the company's legacy forever at this point, but this particular Subway also has some ghosts to contend with. This location was once a Harley-Davidson motorcycle shop, the owners of which died in a car crash in 1984, on Friday the 13th no less, and to this day customers and staff feel this eerie presence in the restaurant. A presence that many believe is the spirit of the former owner's wife. Staff working alone late at night have claimed to see the ghostly figure of a woman standing behind the cash register. Sometimes names are called out even though no one is there. Items get inexplicably knocked off of shelves, and the door's buzzer will occasionally go off even though, you guessed it, there's no one around.
Did you know that Subway's bread can't be classified as bread because of the sugar content? So, not very healthy. None of these are. Next up, we have the haunted Pizza Hut location in Wooster, Ohio. According to a local historian, the restaurant was built on the site of a former asylum, which wasn't necessarily kind to its patients. Anyone who's been with this channel for even a week probably knows by now, old asylums almost always equal haunted buildings. But it appears that even after the old hospital was torn down and replaced with a red-roofed pizza-making fast food factory, say that 5 times fast, the ghosts are still calling the lot home. Many employees who work at this location have told of seeing ghosts and shadowy figures appearing throughout the building. Not only that, but it's not uncommon for employees and customers to hear the sounds of doors opening and shutting, even though there's no doors around where the noises are coming from. Perhaps it's the ghosts slipping in and out of hospital rooms past. Footsteps have often been heard around the restaurant as well. One manager of the establishment even claimed to have been followed by by an eerie mist while closing one night, and other employees have heard music coming from an unknown source and reported feeling themselves being grabbed or touched out of nowhere and when no one else is around. That's pretty scary, if you ask me.
The Arby's in Colorado Springs is said to be haunted by the ghost of a former manager. She'd fired an employee earlier in the day who showed up at the restaurant later that day, armed, and fired at the manager, killing her instantly. Imagine killing your manager for being fired from an Arby's. That's pretty sad. Some really spooky stuff is said to go on at this Arby's. When employees think they're alone, either opening earlier in the morning or closing for the night, they'll sometimes see a woman wandering through the kitchen before disappearing out the back door. Some will also hear ghostly whispers, even their own name being spoken. And closers will often find chairs neatly placed back on the floor after they've put them on top of the tables for the night. I hate stuff with chairs. Chairs moving around, it's creepy.
I love how out of like all the things we talk about, it's chairs.
I don't know, I need chairs in my house for that reason.
This next one is pretty gruesome. While I don't know if this McDonald's location in China is necessarily actually haunted, some pretty haunting and absolutely pure evil stuff did go down within its walls. On August 18th of 2012, 6 members of a Christian splinter cult belonging to the Church of Almighty God entered the establishment and began badgering the patrons of the restaurant, asking for their phone numbers so that the cult may contact them later and provide them with information about the church. Most of the patrons reluctantly gave in, with the hopes of having the cult members leave, but one woman, Wu Shoyan, refused. The cult, believing her to be a demon, tied her to a chair in front of her children, and then in a fit of rage beat her to death. When cult members were questioned by police, they showed no remorse and simply told officials that the woman was an evil spirit and that they did not fear the law as God was on their side. They were arrested and later executed for their crimes, as they should be. It was really gross.
The Papa John's in Seymour, Indiana is said to be haunted by possibly a few different ghosts. One is the spirit of a former police officer who was killed in the plaza. There have been a few policemen who have died in the area, but in the Papa John's, especially on quiet nights, staff have claimed to see the semi-translucent figure of a man in a blue uniform. Many believe it to be the ghost of one of these police officers. One of the creepiest occurrences is the ghostly knocking as well. For a long time, the storefront connected to the Papa John's was completely vacant, but customers and staff would often hear an eerie knocking sound coming from next door.
Finally, to finish off our list today, we have a lesser-known fast food restaurant east of Chicago Pizza, located in Shreve, Ohio. A lot of Ohios on this list today. The site in which the fast food pizza restaurant was built was once the site of a funeral home. Before that, a speakeasy, and before that, a depot, a boarding room, and a titanium factory, each with their own tragic history, which caused many deaths to take place on the grounds, which have caused the grounds to become haunted by many ghosts. One ghost, known as Harvey, is known to smoke vanilla cigars in the establishment's walk-in freezer, and sometimes he will even lock the freezer door and turn the lights on and off. Another ghost, Mimi, plays with the clock and messes with any bills that might get left on the counter, sometimes marking them with a red X. Coffee pots flying out of the coffee maker, slamming doors, unexplained voices, and footsteps have also been reported in the restaurant. And employees of the establishment have said that after closing time, they often hear footsteps coming from upstairs, despite the fact that the restaurant has no upstairs. I'm guessing at least one of the other places did, though. Next up, we have the former conspiracy theory outlining the United States government's dark tactics used to deter its people from drinking during Prohibition in the 1920s. In 1927, after many reports of people getting violently ill after consuming even the tiniest amount of alcohol began to circulate, the public began coming up with theories as to why that might be. The most popular theory being that the government was somehow poisoning their supply. Of course, seeing as it's on this list, that theory did turn out to be true. In the early 1930s, the government actually admitted to having tainted a large amount of alcohol with methanol, a commonly used antifreeze and then distributing it to the public. So the government admitted to their wrongdoings, but maybe not fully. They claimed the amount of methanol added to the alcohol wasn't enough to be lethal, just enough to deter people from drinking. However, during the time in which the tainted alcohol circulated, around 10,000 deaths were reported. Cause of death? Poisoning. Coincidence? Probably not.
In 1982, one of the worst video games in history was released, E.T. the Extraterrestrial for the Atari 2600. The game was created by Howard Scott Warshaw, who has even come out admitting to how awful the game was. He was under a really tight time constraint, completing the game in just 5 weeks. The terrible game was a total flop upon release. Not only was it bad, there was also a bit of a video game recession in 1983. Well, not long after this game came out, a story started to spread around schoolyards across the country that Atari was plagued with all these unsold ET video game cartridges. So, desperate and embarrassed, they resorted to burying them out in the middle of the New Mexico desert like they were the mob disposing of a body after a hit. It's a pretty ridiculous story. A lot of people thought it was just, youngsters exaggerating and blowing the whole thing out of proportion, but it turns out that this urban legend was actually all true. In 2015, the cartridges were even dug up and sold off, allowing all those who'd missed out on this confusing and really gaudy game in the early 80s, to give it a try for themselves.
Next up, we have the conspiracy theory that the government controls the weather, which isn't actually a conspiracy theory, but just a scientific reality. It's called cloud seeding, which is an age-old technique that uses silver iodide particles to promote rain. Basically, they send planes into the sky to shoot particles into the clouds, which causes the water droplets to get heavy, which causes it to rain. See? Science. And it's not new science either, it's actually like 60 years old. The technology was used during the Vietnam War to wash out the Ho Chi Minh Trail, making it difficult for US adversaries on the ground to maneuver around combat areas. Countries that currently use cloud seeding include the United Arab Emirates, China, and, of course, the US. While deciding when it's going to rain might seem pretty cool, there is a downside to the practice as well. Too much silver iodide can lead to flooding and pollution, which in turn could cause respiratory issues, skin issues, and gastrointestinal problems. So, if you're the government watching this, seed wisely, please.
In 1975, during a congressional testimony, it was revealed that the CIA had been working on a heart attack pistol, which is gonna sound like something out of a spy movie when I describe it, but it was, and maybe still is, very much a thing. It's a covert weapon that shoots a tiny dart capable of piercing clothing without leaving much of a mark at all, and when it hits its target, the person might not even realize it. They might just feel a little sting or nothing at all. The dart carries a deadly poison, and it all disintegrates once it's in the body, making it almost impossible to detect in an autopsy. The poison works fast, causing a heart attack soon after entering the bloodstream. All of this was revealed during a US Senate hearing in 1975. The CIA had to own up to some of their shadier activities at the time, and this heart attack weapon was one of the things they had to disclose.
And finally, we have Operation Northwoods, which never happened, but almost happened, and if it did happen, it would have been pretty messed up. In the 1960s, the United States had planned an attack on Cuba known as the Bay of Pigs invasion. On April 17th of 1961, the US attempted to carry out the invasion on Cuban soil, but were quickly thwarted by Cuba's military forces. While some members of the American brigade, known as Brigade 2506, managed to escape, almost 1,200 surrendered and more than 100 men were killed. The ordeal ended on April 20th of the same year, but conspiracy theories following the failed invasion certainly did not. US citizens began speculating that the government was planning flagship operations, attacks on their own people that they would blame on Cuba to encourage a divide between the two countries and to make themselves look better. Well, it turned out that the people were right. Operation Northwoods, while it never went went ahead was an operation in which the government had planned to stage a communist Cuban terror campaign on Miami, Florida, after which they would arrest Cuban agents and then release prepared documents substantiating Cuban involvement. Basically, they were embarrassed after losing big time to Cuba and were looking for a way to save face. Luckily, the operation never made it out of the planning stages, and it was later revealed in 2001, with officials stating that the reason it took them so long to disclose the project was simply that it was incredibly embarrassing that the idea ever gained as much traction as it did in the first place. And I agree, that is incredibly embarrassing.
Next up at number 5, Robert Hansen. Known in the media as the Butcher Baker, Hansen was an extremely sick killer who quite literally viewed his victims as prey. In his adolescence, Robert was an awkward and shy boy who had absolutely no luck with girls. These early rejections festered into a deep hatred for women, for which he later would seek revenge. As he got older, he began finding solace in archery and hunting, and would routinely spend his time perfecting his craft alone in the woods. Then, in the early 1960s, he began seeking revenge, at first by committing arson on his high school property, but then soon turned to seek revenge on women specifically. By 1971, he was kidnapping and taking advantage of women, but not yet killing. He was charged and sentenced to 5 years for his crimes, but after just 6 months was released on a work program. After his release is where it really got scary. He began kidnapping women and escorts, taking them back to his apartment where he would do awful things to their bodies, before flying them out to secluded areas in the wilderness and telling them he was going to hunt them down and kill them. Tragically, an estimated 21 women lost their lives to this monster, but thankfully he was convicted and sentenced to 461 years in prison without possibility of parole. Moving on to number 4, Albert Fish. Also known as the Brooklyn Vampire, Albert Fish was a terrifying killer responsible for the death of 3 people in the mid-1920s, although according to him, it was well over 100. Fish grew up in an unstable home. Both his parents suffered from mental illness, and after his father died, he was sent to live at an orphanage. While there, he was by the other orphans, but he started to develop a rather confusing feeling towards the pain. He began to enjoy it. As Fish got older, he started seeking darker and more twisted things to feel alive, and soon that led to the kidnapping, taking advantage of, killing, and later devouring of minors. Thankfully, the monster was caught in 1935, and shockingly, he wasted no time denying his atrocities. In fact, he almost seemed proud of them. I can't, and frankly won't, go into detail about what he did, but it is some of the most disgusting stuff I have ever read about. And I can only imagine the agents on his case felt the same. Eventually, Fish was sentenced to death and died by electric chair in 1936. After his death, his lawyer refused to release his final statement, saying, quote, "I will never show it to anyone. It was the most filthy string of obscenities that I have ever read." Next up at number 3, Michael James Pratt. Currently on the FBI's top 10 most wanted, I can only imagine how disturbed the FBI was when they first became aware of this case. Between approximately 2012 to 2019, Michael Pratt, along with a few accomplices, was involved in recruiting underage girls to be a part of an adult film production company that he owned and operated. Pratt lured the girls in under Craigslist ads asking for models, and from there he promised payment in exchange for a clothed modeling gig. But sadly, this couldn't have been further from what he had planned for the victims. Beyond the obviously morally despicable stuff they were making these girls do, he would also force past victims into providing false assurance to the girls that their films would never end up online. Allegedly, some of the victims were not permitted to leave locations until the shoot was completed, others were forced to perform after declining participation, and the crew was also known to commit SA when the girls wouldn't comply. After fleeing the country in 2019, right before his trial for his crimes, he was added to the FBI list, and the search for this creep continues. Moving on to number 2, Mark Putnam. In the mid-1980s, Mark Putnam was a happy husband, father, and successful FBI agent. But after relocating to the Bureau's Pikeville office, things began to change. At this time, Carl Edwards Lockhart, a notorious bank robber, had just been let out of prison, and Putnam believed that he was back to his old ways. So he began gathering informants that could help him take down Lockhart. One of these informants was Susan Smith, addicted divorcee raising a family who needed the cash. But soon, she became more than just Putnam's informant. The two began an affair, and by 1989, Smith was allegedly pregnant. This terrified Putnam. He knew it would not only ruin his marriage, but end his career, and so he demanded a paternity test and explained he and his wife could adopt from her. This, however, led to a violent fight between them that ultimately ended with Putnam strangling Susan to death. Initially, the suspect was Susan's ex-husband, but soon Putnam was interrogated, and after failing a polygraph, he confessed to the whole thing and offered to lead the FBI to where she was. However, there are a few mysteries. Susan Smith's sister claimed that FBI agent Ron Poole, Putnam's superior, not only knew about Smith's alleged pregnancy, but also disclosed to Smith information about Putnam's illicit activities with other informants. And allegedly, medical examiners claimed that they were unable to find any trace of a fetus during an autopsy on Smith, who should have been 4 months pregnant. I mean, it's just all disturbing top to bottom. And last up in our number 1 spot, the Brianna Denison case. Brianna Denison was a college student home for the holidays in Reno, Nevada, when tragically one night she went missing while staying over at a friend's house. In the days following, the Reno Police Department conducted an investigation at her friend's home, where she had last been seen, and concluded she had been abducted after discovering male DNA on a doorknob and her own on a pillowcase. At this point, the FBI became involved in the search, and after investigations linked the male DNA to other open cases involving sexually violent crimes, they worried that the missing girl's fate had already been decided. And sadly, nearly a month after she had gone missing, Brianna was found dead in a ditch. That fall, after lengthy investigations, interrogations, and DNA samples, they finally found the man guilty of the crime, James Biella. And it came out that he had actually held her captive in his home for several days, harming and doing awful things to her body before he eventually killed her. And to top it off, he lived 1 block from FBI agents, 2 sheriffs, and a local police officer. So he was literally doing it all under their nose. Well, that's all I have for you today, friends. I hope you liked this one, and make sure to hit that subscribe button before you go. See you next time.
Hey, you made it to the end of the video. You have to watch this video next, Mysterious Artifacts in Egypt That Defy Explanation. The original home to all of the megalithic structures has some mysterious artifacts that can't be explained. What are you waiting for? Click the video now.